Transcriptions as well. Cool. Okay, so welcome everyone to the second day of this extended exam cram for DP-500. Thanks again to Nikola and Andy, and welcome everyone. I'm going to leave it there and just hand over straight to both of you.
Thanks very much, Justin. So I think, Nikola, you are up first with your Power BI stuff.
That's true. So let me start sharing my screen. I hope you can see it now.
Yes,
okay.
We can see it.
Perfect. So as Justin and Andy already said, welcome to the second evening of our series for DP-500 exam cram. And since we have a lot of to cover today, I suggest let's jump straight into the action. So don't pay attention on this date. This was supposed to be last Thursday, but we postponed it. So we will jump straight into the action, talking about Power BI topics first. And what's more important than talking about security? So how to secure your data in Power BI. Or maybe it's better to say how to control the access to certain portions of your Power BI solution. You can choose between row-level security and object-level security. You will probably hear me referring to those two as RLS and OLS, abbreviations for row-level and object-level security. So let's start by making a quick distinction between these two and in which scenarios would make sense to use row-level security or object-level security. There are certain scenarios where you might want to use both of them, even though it's sometimes a little bit painful. So we will start with the older cousin, and that's row-level security, which is a feature that is available for a long time in Power BI. So what is the idea of row-level security? The idea is to restrict access to data for specific users or groups of users on a row level. Now, when I say on a row level, I refer to row level security as limiting access to specific attribute or attributes. For example, country. Let's say I want to see only data for UK or only for Germany. Then for product category, for example, just deluxe products or regular products and so on. Customers, location, and so on and so on. So nevertheless, if they are displayed as rows or columns in your report. So think of them like restricting access to specific attributes. On the other hand, I prefer to think about object level security as limiting access to numbers or measures, such as, for example, unit cost or company costs, company expenses, and so on. Also with object level security, as its name suggests, because it's object, you can omit whole objects from your data model, tables or columns. And when you omit the column from the table, so when you set object level security for the specific column, all the measures that are dependent on this column will also be omitted from data model. But more or less, more on that in the next few minutes. So going back to explain row level security in more detail. First of all, row level security works for both import mode and direct query, but it's not available in live connection mode to analysis services or Azure Analysis Services data sources. Or maybe it's better to say row level security is in fact available, but has to be defined on the source side. So we are talking about defining row level security within the Azure Analysis Services data model, not in Power BI Desktop. So we start by defining the role and using DAX to set specific filters. For example, let's say that I want to restrict access only to data for where country is Canada. I will set the filter that says display only those rows where the country equals Canada. If you're coming from the SQL background, you can think of these conditions as where clause in the SQL statement. And there are two main types of row level security in Power BI, static and dynamic. So let's first examine static row level security. This one is useful in basic scenarios when there are not many users, no complex restriction requirements, and access rules are not changing so frequently. You can think of it based on our previous example. So all users from Canada will always be able to see only the numbers from Canada. So it's not changing so frequently. Rules for static row level security are being maintained from within a PBIX file. That's important to keep in mind. It's often very easy and straightforward setup, but there are some downsides. Let's name a few of them. First, maintenance overhead. Then you have a lot of manual work, and static row level security is not reusable because it's defined on a certain PBIX file level. For dynamic row level security, it requires slightly more complicated setup, but it gives you the possibility to control the access on a more granular level. So unlike in the previous case, here access control is defined within the data model via tables and relationships. The good side of dynamic row level security is that it's reusable and requires less maintenance from your side, but the most noticeable downside is that it adds to model complexity because you need to add additional tables and relationships within your data model. There are many great articles on the web explaining step by step how to create and manage dynamic row level security. The essential idea is to leverage user principal name DAX function to capture the login of the user that is currently browsing the report. And based on the rules you specified in your data model, users with specific login credentials will be able to see only certain parts of the data. Other than that, I would say we can talk about different considerations in row level row level security. First one is when you have one user in multiple roles. So row level security filters work in an additive way. That means if you have a user that is a member of the role, let's say employee, that restricts access to attribute salary, and if you have this same user, which is a member of role finance, that has access to this attribute salary, this user will be able to see the data. So it works in additive way. Performance impact. Row level security is a very powerful feature for controlling the access to the data. But like most of the powerful features, this one also comes with a price because row level security will apply additional filters to every single DAX query generated by Power BI report. It may happen that row level security is responsible for the performance downgrade. Not always, it depends on a lot of things, but it can be responsible for slower performance of the report. Recommended practice is to assign Azure Active Directory groups instead of individual user accounts to defined dataset roles, because that reduces the maintenance overhead. In case that someone leaves your organization and or need to change something, it's easier to control access through Azure Active Directory groups. And finally, I suggest you to check the official guidance for row level security on Microsoft Learn Microsoft documentation site. Before object level security, now we are talking about object level security. Before object level security was introduced in Power BI, there was some tricks and workarounds to hide the whole table from specific users, but it's now much easier with having this object level security feature under our belts. The key difference between row level security and object level security is that, of course, they're operating on different, let's say, perspectives. But the main difference is that when you apply row level security using DAX filters, so the case we were examining previously, data will not be displayed in the report, but the underlying metadata objects are still part of the data model. So they still exist in the data model. With object level security, these underlying objects, for example, if you choose to set object level security to none on a certain column or a certain table, this object is completely obscured from the data model. In plain words, these objects don't exist in your data model, and users that don't have users that don't have permissions to access them will not even, so for them, these objects are not part of the model at all. As I said, additionally, all measures that refer to the restricted column will also, let's say, disappear from the data model. So how do you set object level security? Maybe I can do a quick demo. So for setting object level security, you can't use Power BI desktop. You need external tool, which is called Tabular Editor. I sincerely hope that you are all familiar with Tabular Editor, and not just that you're familiar, but that you are also using it on a regular basis. So if I open Tabular Editor, in my case, let's open the free version, and I can see all of my tables. Let's say that in my fact online sales table, I want to set object level security to none for my sales amount. So here it is, my column sales amount and object level security. Maybe just a second, just to zoom it a little bit, it will be easier, I think. So here it is, object level security. And I have one role that is already defined within my report, which is called Europe. And then I can, instead of default, I can set it to none. And now if I go back and save this report, all the users who are members of Europe role will not be able to see neither sales amount column, neither any measure that references this column. So those objects are completely eliminated from the data model. Keep in mind, you have to use Tabular Editor for object level security. You can't define it through Power BI desktop. Next topic, also very important, XMLA endpoints. So I like to start this story talking about the evolution of Microsoft Power BI as an independent product. I think it started somewhere in 2015 or something like that. And, you know, in the beginning, it was a shy challenger in the business intelligence analytics space. Now it's obvious a leader and undisputable leader in that area. But during these 8 years, there were many so-called game changers in Power BI. Composite models, data flows, AI visuals. I mean, you can name it. However, one of the features that truly opened a whole new world of possibilities, but which is probably still not so fancy and popular like some of those that I mentioned. This is using XMLA endpoint to access the underlying Power BI datasets. And although a lot of people still consider Power BI as a data visualization tool, I have to admit that Power BI is a data modeling tool in the first place. And that's why it is extremely important to understand what are XML endpoints and why should you care about them in the final instance. So let's start with the basics. You maybe heard about XML standard, but what on earth is now XMLA? Don't be afraid, it's just that. So it's XML for analysis. Of course, let's illustrate how this thing works. We have analysis services instance, which exposes the endpoint. Then you can use various client tools, for example, Tabular Editor, SQL Server Management Studio, Azure Data Studio, SQL Server Data Tools, and other tools to talk to this analysis services instance. If you're now wondering, okay, Nikola, what's so special about being able to talk to analysis services instance? Well, like in regular real-life talks where you can instruct someone what to do, the same applies to talk with analysis services instance. So using a client tool, you may read the content of the analysis services instance, but what is even more important, you can also manipulate this tabular object model, which is stored in analysis services instance, and you can modify its default behavior. So if you think of XMLA endpoint as some brand new Power BI exclusive feature, you can't be more wrong. So for us who are old enough to use to work with SQL Server analysis multidimensional, using XMLA is a well-known concept. So it's a long-lasting relationship between analysis services and XMLA. Now, you're probably asking yourself, why does he persistently repeat analysis services, analysis services? I'm working with Power BI, I'm a Power BI developer, so I'm interested to find out how this XMLA thing works in Power BI. So that's a fair point, and I'll try to explain this as quickly as possible. So when you open Power BI desktop to create a solution, I've intentionally used the word solution instead of the report. Power BI, so what's going to happen is Power BI will spin up a local instance of analysis services behind the scenes, so you can't see it, but it's there to store the data you are using in your solution. Of course, assuming that you're using import mode for your data. And once you're done, you will deploy your solution to Power BI service, right? And once you do that, you will probably notice that two artifacts are deployed together, report and dataset. So Power BI dataset is nothing else than a database in the analysis services instance, okay? Similar to that, Power BI Workspace is nothing else than analysis services instance that takes care of all your different databases or Power BI datasets. You can call it however you want. Now we are coming to the question from the beginning: why does XML endpoint availability is important in Power BI? So before, let's go back to the past, and before XML endpoint availability for Power BI solutions, the usual development process looked something like this. So of course, it's a simplified version. So you work in Power BI Desktop, you create a solution in Power BI Desktop, and once you are done, you deploy this to Power BI Service, okay? In case you need to do some changes, you take this file again in Power BI Desktop, you make desired changes, and you publish it again. And it was all or nothing approach before XML endpoint availability. You couldn't have changed one table without reprocessing the whole dataset. But we could somehow live with that, let's be honest. However, certain data model properties were completely inaccessible from the Power BI Desktop, and there was no way to change their default behavior. Now, let's imagine this scenario. You have a huge Power BI report with 20 tables, and you just need to apply a minor change to one of them. So instead of reprocessing the whole model by leveraging the XML endpoint, you can reprocess only the table that you modified. So when to use XML endpoints? Here, possibilities are really limitless, except for this example, where with processing just one table or just partition of the table, you may also use XML endpoints to query the data. You can add new columns, you can modify existing ones using in a programmatical way. You can also switch data sources for your Power BI report or add, for example, explicit data source definition. Additionally, all of the things you're performing from, let's say, tabular editor, such as defining object level security, which we were talking about like 10 minutes ago, calculation groups, creating partitions, perspectives, all of that is done through XML endpoint. And as I said, possibilities are limitless, and probably a whole, I would say maybe not a book, but there should be a white paper covering all the available use cases when using XML endpoints. One important thing that I want you to keep in mind regarding XML endpoints is that once you make changes to XML endpoint and you deploy this updated version of Power BI solution to a Power BI service, you will not be able to download the PBIX file anymore. That's important consideration. So always keep the backup version of the file in case you need to apply some additional modifications. Okay, so far we've explained what happens when you hit the publish button in Power BI Desktop. And assuming that you are not using a live connection mode, once you publish the report, as we already learned, two artifacts will be deployed to a destination workspace. Report itself, but also dataset which the report is based on. Then this dataset can be reused again as the source for other reports, but more on that in other sections. However, beside these two artifacts, report and dataset, there are also some additional options available for handling our analytic workloads. And one of these options is a data flow. It's a very important concept, especially in enterprise-grade implementations, and as such deserves a thorough understanding and explanation. So let's first try to demystify what is a data flow. In most simple words, a data flow is a set of tables that contains the data. And that set of tables can be reused across multiple reports within your organization. Think of, for example, date or calendar table that is basically, I would say, integral part of every reporting solution. So instead of using, for example, DAX code to create a date table within each and every Power BI report, you can use data flows, create a date table as a data flow, and then reuse this table across all the reports within the organization. It's not just about the reusability, but also creating a single source of truth. So you can be sure that all your reports and downstream Power BI assets apply the same logic. From a technical point of view, a data flow is nothing else but the CDM or common data model format, which is stored in Azure Data Lake. So before I show you, or I'm not sure if we have time to show you how to create data flows, but it's very straightforward in Power BI service. Let's examine the use cases for data flows. First, if you don't have a proper data warehouse within the organization, or you don't have direct access to a data warehouse. Next, extending the data from the data warehouse by implementing some additional logical layer on top of this data coming from the data warehouse. For slower data sources, data flows may help because the data will be extracted only once and then reused multiple times. Also, for data sources that you pay for, instead of connecting multiple times to this data source, you will connect only once. Reducing the data source complexity.
3 core mix to be fine.
Sorry. Okay, I guess that was by an accident. So reducing the data source complexity. Instead of connecting to multiple data source objects and having all of them in the dependency circle, you can transform and prepare the data within the data flow, thus reducing the overall complexity of your data model. Also, horizontal data partition, meaning you can create multiple data flows based on the same data source. Then let's say that you have a group of users that needs to see the whole data. You can expose the data flow that contains all the data to this specific group. While you can create additional subsets of data, additional data flows containing, as I said, only a subset of this entire data set. Okay, so it's not all that rosy in data flows world. They are powerful, but no matter how powerful they are, there are also certain limitations to keep in mind. The first and most important, data flows are not and should not be a substitute for the data warehouse. Okay, that's the most important thing to keep in mind regarding data flows. Data warehouse, if exists, should still be a central place for the organizational data workload needs, while data flows should be considered as a supplement, not a replacement, just a supplement to data warehouse. The next limitation is inability to use row-level security. Then also, if you're operating on a shared capacities, meaning that your organization has to share the resources with others, you may run into performance issues with data flows. And finally, you can't create linked entities in shared capacity. They can exist, but they have to be disabled for loading. In addition, computed entities that we are going to talk about in the next slide can't be created in shared capacity data flows. Also, incremental refresh is not supported. So there are certain limitations to keep in mind. Okay, so maybe you've heard me mentioning linked entity and computed entity previously, and now you're probably wondering what is a linked entity. So let's try to explain different entity types that exist in the data flows world. First of all, let's go one step back and understand how to create a data flow in the first place. Data flows can't be created in Power BI desktop. That's the first and most important thing to keep in mind. Then if not in desktop, in Power BI desktop, then where? This time, no tabular editor or other external tools. So you create a data flow in Power BI service. And for creating data flows, you're going to use Power Query Online, which more or less works the same way as a regular Power Query editor in Power BI desktop. Now my question to you is, have you ever used a reference option in Power Query desktop? If yeah, probably it would take a long to get answers from all of you, but here is the short explanation. When you're using reference option, you are basically creating a new entity, which is referencing the original query. But you can then extend it with some additional transformation steps. So in this scenario, the original query, the original entity is a prerequisite for this new query. Now, if you choose to go this way in Power Query Online, so in data flow scenario, once you click on reference, you are creating a computed entity. So I'll give you one very, very simple yet very commonly used example. If you want to aggregate the data and have the original detailed data together with aggregated version of this same data. So that's exactly what you can do with computed entity in data flow. So you have the original data set with detailed data and you create a computed entity which contains aggregated data. And now you may think, okay, that's also how it works in Power BI desktop version of Power Query. And you are almost right, but there are some subtle differences in the background, mainly related to the execution logic. Let's say that you want to refresh your data in Power BI. So in the regular Power Query, we are talking about Power Query in Power BI desktop. Assuming that you have these two queries that I was talking about, so original table and aggregated table, both queries, so both detailed and aggregated table, will be populated directly from the data source, something like you see on the left side of the screen. On the other hand, it's different with data flows. The original query, in our case, that would be this huge fact table, will be populated directly from the data source. And then after that, it will be loaded into the Azure Data Lake and stored there as a CDM format. Then the next query, which is computed entity, will target this one from the data lake and not the original data source. Once again, keep in mind that at this moment, creating computed entities is not supported in the share capacity. So you need to have some kind of premium license, either per user or premium per capacity. Now the next consideration, if I create computed entity, should I do this with transformations or without transformations? So when you're dealing with, it depends, that's the correct answer, I would say, and I will now explain on what it depends. But in the end, of course, like usually, it depends. So if you're dealing with non-foldable data sources, remember we were talking about query folding in the previous part of our session. So when you're dealing with those sources like text files, CSV files that don't support query folding, there is no benefit in applying transformations when you are retrieving the data from those sources, especially if you're talking about large data volumes. So what you should do is simply load the data from CSV file to this source entity without applying any transformations, because there is no chance that those transformations will be pushed to a data source. And then computed entities can reference this source entity and apply necessary transformations on top of this source data. You're now probably wondering, what's the point in creating a source entity that simply loads one-to-one data from the data source? However, in many cases, this approach makes sense, because if you reuse the source data across multiple entities, it reduces the load pressure on the data source. Computed entities are therefore very useful in those situations where you handle large data volumes or when you are accessing data source via on-premises gateway. since using a computed entity will reduce the traffic on the on-premises data gateway. If your data source supports query folding, let's say it's a SQL database, it would make sense to perform foldable transformations in the source entity because the query will be folded to the data source and transformed data will be retrieved. Same as in the regular Power Query, this approach improves the overall performance. So all common transformations that are part of the transformation logic for all downstream computed entities should be applied within the source entity. And then all additional entity-specific transformations should be applied on the computed entity. Okay, so keep in mind, this is a famous Roche's maxim. Roche is Matthew Roche from Microsoft's Power BI customer advisory team. You know this famous saying, push your transformations as upstream as possible, as downstream as necessary. That's absolutely 100% true also for data flows use cases. So that was a computed entity. The other entity type is linked entity. Unlike in previous case where you'll probably add some additional transformation logic on top of the original entity. With linked entity, you don't extend any transformation logic. So you simply need a copy of the existing entity from another data flow. So what are the use cases for linked entities? Let's say that I have created a geography entity in my sales data flow, and this entity contains all the attributes I need: continent, country, city, zip code, and so on. Now, chances are that I will need this geography data for other departments in my organization, like, for example, marketing or HR and so on. So instead of going and creating the very same entity in each of these departments, I can simply use a copy of this existing entity or just link to it from the current data flow. Because I'm just using a link to this entity and not physically created a new instance of this same entity, I can't apply any additional transformation steps on top of this linked entity. So it's one-to-one copy. That's it. What is the refresh logic of linked entities? So it depends on whether the source data flow is in the same Power BI workspace as the destination data flow. First, if links between workspaces, refresh for links from entities in different workspaces behaves like a link to an external data source. So when the data flow is refreshed, it takes the latest data from the entity from the source data flow. If the source data flow is refreshed, it doesn't automatically affect the data in the destination data flow. If they are in same workspace, then all your linked entities will be automatically refreshed when the data is changed. Since we will share, yeah.
So we have a question for you. So Philip has asked, can you make a computed entity from a linked entity?
No. Basically, when you use a linked entity, no more transformations are supported. So that's it. If you, in case that you need to apply any additional logic, you need to go to the original entity, which use as a source for the linked entities, apply all transformations, and then this will be propagated to the linked entity. So there are no other transformations available on linked entities. Okay, so this is a short overview because data flows and Azure Data Factory has a lot of overlapping. Azure Data Factory is a more robust cloud solution for ETL tasks than data flows. Once we share this presentation, you will get this table so you can easily spot the differences and use cases for each of those solutions. I will not spend time explaining each of these. Fine. Now we are moving to administration and governance part of Power BI. And we'll start with Power BI licensing, which is, I would say, one of the most confusing areas for many Power BI newbies. So let's try to demystify Power BI licensing in plain English, to put it that way. So the first distinction to keep in mind when we are talking about Power BI licensing is between per user licenses and capacity-based licenses. That's the highest level of distinction. So we have per user licenses and per capacity licenses. Let's now focus on understanding per user licenses. You have three different license types for users: free license, pro license, and premium per user license. On the other hand, it's just two choice when we are talking about organizational licenses. Your company either pays for a dedicated capacity, which is what we are calling premium capacity, or they don't pay and your workspace are placed in the shared capacity. When I say shared, that means you are sharing resources with other organizations that don't pay. So that's shared capacity. Now let's examine the per user licenses. We'll start with the simplest one, that is a free license. And again, there are two possible perspectives of understanding what is possible and what is available with a free license. If you're a report author, you can create a fully fledged Power BI report in Power BI Desktop using all the features that are available to users with paid licenses. So there is a free lunch for you if you're a report author. But once you're done and you want everyone to see how magnificent Power BI developer you are, sorry, you can't really do that. The only thing you can do is to publish the report to My Workspace. My Workspace comes with many limitations. Most important, no one else can access the content in My Workspace except you. And also certain Power BI assets are not available with creation of those assets are not supported with free license. For example, data flows. As we already learned, data flows can be only created in Power BI service, but My Workspace doesn't allow creation of data flows. So with free license, no data flows. On the other side, and this is really important, if you're a report consumer with a free license and your organization has implemented premium capacity, you can consume the content without paying anything. Okay? To be honest, your company is already paying for you, so yeah, why not? So that was the free license. Let's now explain pro license. Again, from the perspective of both content author and content consumer. So if you're a content creator, your shiny Power BI report potentially can reach many consumers. So you can publish your report everywhere, meaning to both regular and premium workspaces. That's easy to understand. Now, if you're a report consumer and your organization doesn't pay for the dedicated or premium capacity, you as a consumer also need pro license to consume the content. Price of pro license at this moment is $10 per user per month. Okay, and let's wrap up this per user license story with explaining how premium per user license works. You can think of it as pro license on steroids. So that means you get all the pro features plus most of the features that are available in premium capacity-based licenses. So don't mix premium per capacity with premium per user. Those two are different, but you get a lot of features from premium per capacity also with premium per user license. Same as with pro license, content author can publish everywhere. Again, important difference compared to pro is, again, if there is no premium capacity, you as a consumer will also need premium per user license to consume the report. So it's not enough to have pro license if the workspace is not part of premium capacity. Premium per user license comes in two different flavors. First one is add-on on existing pro license when you pay additional $10 per month, or as a standalone product for $20 per month per user. So when I explaining Power BI licensing, I know that this all sounds a little bit overwhelming, so I'll always try to use this analogy to explain how different license types work in Power BI. So imagine that you started working for a company and you wish to go to the gym, and you are not alone. There are also other colleagues that would like to visit the gym. Now, what are the possible options for company to make you and those other employees happy? So first of all, they can pay a gym pass for you. Let's say $10 per month. I intentionally using this amount, which is equivalent to pro license in Power BI. And each and every month they will pay $10 for every one of you. It's a Power BI Pro license. Then next month, another 50 colleagues want to go to the gym. So the company will pay $10 per month for each of them. Then after getting more and more requests, let's imagine that 500 of you want to visit the gym every month. It's $5,000 per month. Wow. So the company, what company can do? Company may decide to buy a gym. So yes, they can buy the whole gym just for you. And you know what? If there are additional 500 colleagues that want to go to the gym, feel free. There you go. We have our own gym with all the latest and greatest devices, machines, coffee machine, and so on. And that's a premium capacity-based license. Just to be clear, here we are talking about the consumers. Your colleagues that provide, build, and maintain gym equipment still need to pay $10 per month. If we translate this to Power BI, content authors will still need to pay for Pro license. Even though the organization is paying for premium capacity, content creators still need at least Pro license. Okay, so here is all again overview who can access what depending on the license type, and I would like to draw a few conclusions here. First of all, premium capacity makes sense for a large number of consumers. Remember the gym story. So once the number of consumers starts to grow above, let's say 500, then it makes sense to for company to purchase the premium capacity. Premium capacity also makes sense for very large data models. With share capacity, there is a maximum data model size limit of 1 gigabyte. So if you're dealing with large models, premium capacity is the way to go. And premium per user finally makes sense for small number of users, but for those users that need premium features. And we will cover some of them in the next minutes. So that's how, what are the recommended use cases for each licensing option in Power BI. When we are talking about creating reusable assets in Power BI, we have three different types of assets that we can create. First one is well-known PBIX file, which basically contains everything. Meaning, when I say everything, connections, data sets, transformations, so the whole metadata, but also including the real data. On the other hand, PBIT or Power BI template file contains everything same as PBIX, but no real data. So just definitions, just metadata. And finally, Power BI data source or PBIDS, which saves only the link to the data source. Now, deployment pipelines, that's one of the newer features in Power BI. And three things that I think are worth mentioning regarding deployment pipelines. So first of all, for those of you who are maybe not aware, deployment pipelines are application lifecycle management feature within Power BI. So they deployment pipelines helps you to apply how it's called CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous development. So in this case, this is the solution for Power BI. Keep in mind that permissions for deployment pipelines are managed separately from workspace permissions, and there is only one role for deployment pipelines, which is called pipeline admin. So in combination with workspace roles, you define users or group of users who can do certain actions on deployment pipelines. By configuring parameter rules, you can make this more dynamic. So you can store connection details such as instance names, database names, and so on, instead of using static connection strings. And finally, you can automate deployment pipelines with Azure DevOps or Power BI REST APIs. All of this is very important, but keep in mind that at this moment, deployment pipelines are premium only feature, so they are not available with Pro license. Okay, so we are slowly moving. So let me check the timings. Oh, okay, I'm already over time. So yeah, but let's cover a few more topics that are important. When you're designing your Power BI reports, you need to keep in mind certain things. As you may know, the same report may look completely different across different devices. So report with exactly the same data points looks very different on your desktop screen compared to, for example, tablet or mobile device. And similar applies to different persons. You have to keep in mind that there are people out there that might have visual or motor or cognitive impairments. So the same report may look very different from perspective of users with those deficiencies. If you ask yourself, why is this important? So that is a harsh name, normal. I apologize for this. So maybe I should have phrased this differently. But let's say normal in terms that you don't have any visual impairments. That's how you would see this balloon flying over these beautiful green fields. But if you're diagnosed with deuteranopia, which is a medical name for green blindness, this same picture looks very, very different. And that's why accessibility is very important. Here is the list of accessibility features that are provided out of the box by Power BI. So those on the left side, built-in features, you don't need to configure them at all. So they are provided here out of the box. There are also some features that are provided out of the box, but they require additional configuration. For example, alt text, tab order, labels and titles, that's something that you need to take care of. Themes, contrast, colors, again, this is a wide topic. We can talk about this in next 60 minutes at least. But keep in mind that you don't want to transmit important information using colors only. So always support your data storytelling with some additional features. And we are wrapping up this Power BI part with talking about external tools. Again, we are moving from Power BI desktop, and there is a wonderful world of external tools out there. You see just 3 on your screens, but there are many, many more, of course, out there. But we want to focus specifically on these 3. Before we jump to explain DAX Studio, Tabular Editor, and Vertipack Analyzer, one important remark. External tools are developed and maintained by third-party contributors, not Microsoft itself. So external tools come with one serious limitation, or let's call it consideration. They are not officially supported by Microsoft. However, that shouldn't minimize their importance, especially when we are talking about 2 mainstream and widely adopted tools such as DAX Studio and Tabular Editor. First of all, DAX Studio. This is an amazing tool created by Darren Gosbell, guy from Australia who now works for Microsoft, and SQL BI guys, so Marco and Alberto. And I think it's fair to say if you're dealing with performance troubleshooting and you're not using DAX Studio, good luck with that. I don't know what else to say. So DAX Studio offers a whole range of handy features that, yeah, I could probably talk about them in the next hour or so, but let's try to focus on few that you will be using most often when troubleshooting report performance. So you can use DAX Studio to write your DAX measures, to fine-tune performance of your Power BI solutions. You can analyze physical and logical query plan, and you can also measure the performance of the Power BI engine, meaning 2 parts of the engine, formula engine and storage engine, how much time within your queries split between those 2. That's whole another topic, but keep in mind, use DAX Studio to obtain this information. Tabular Editor, another very popular external tool developed by Daniel Otekir. You should be aware that there are 2 versions of the product out there. Tabular Editor 2, which you have seen when I showed you object level security. That's a free version. You can download it from GitHub. On the other hand, there is also Tabular Editor 3. That is a commercial version of this product, which offers many advanced features. Honestly, you can achieve most of your development tasks with a free version, but I would say it's worth investing in Tabular Editor 3 in this commercial version. It offers you more advanced capabilities and more advanced features. Okay, so unlike DAX Studio that we are mostly using for troubleshooting DAX performance, Tabular Editor main purpose is to manipulate tabular object model. So creating objects like calculation groups, setting object level security, creating custom KPIs, changing the relationships, changing tables, and so on and so on. So it's data modeling tool at first place. And finally, VertiPack Analyzer, whenever you want to understand data storage structures inside the VertiPack, there is no better tool than VertiPack Analyzer. So VertiPack Analyzer can be downloaded as a standalone product, but it's also part of DAX Studio. So if you're using DAX Studio, you can also find VertiPack Analyzer there. So what VertiPack Analyzer is doing, it collects the data from various dynamic management views and displays this data in a structured and more readable, let's say more human user-friendly way than if you go and query all these dynamic management views on your own using, for example, I don't know, SQL Server Management Studio. VertiPack Analyzer is especially useful when you need to determine the data model size, as it enables you to understand the size of different data model structures like tables, columns, hierarchies, relationships, and so on and so on. So those three, are worth mentioning, and they're part of the exam, but also keep in mind that there are many other very cool and useful external tools out there. Pay attention to PBI tools. The latest addition to this external tool is this new language TMDL that will soon be officially supported by Microsoft. And I think, yes, we are now done with Power BI topics. I'll stop sharing and hand it over to my friend Andy.
So Nikola, just before we do, I just want to have one question. Oh, look, Andy's back on Super Zoom. Oh, he's fixed it. Right, so one question for you. Philip asked, if I create data flows in a premium workspace as a premium per user and use these as sources in a Power BI desktop file, create a report and publish it to a pro workspace, then the pro users can't see it, or I can't publish it to the pro workspace. So I guess is what happens if I attempt to publish it to a pro workspace? Yeah,
that's a good question. So yeah, I'll need to double check what happens. In any case, they can't access it. I'm not sure if you can publish it at all. I'm not sure, but I'll check during the end this part. I will check and let you know. But it's definitely not accessible.
Okay, so am I ready to finish off? I think so. Just let me know whether you can hear me okay.
Yeah, all good.
Okay, so I have been having some network issues with my ISP. So if it gets a bit jittery, let me know and I'll switch my camera off. So let me share my screen. Move Teams away. Oops, let me just move that over there. Okay, so mixtures of demos and slides to finish the session off. So we were talking yesterday about Synapse Analytics and serverless SQL pools data types. So we'll just finish that off. So I'm just going to open my develop tab and go to my list of files. So just very quickly to recap, let me just get zoom it up, is that serverless SQL pools supports CSV files or delimited files, Parquet files, Delta Lake, and JSON. but JSON will always be connected to like a CSV. So for example, if I open up CSV here, then we've got our select statements that's using all the different options to be able to connect to the CSV file. In the Parquet files, let me just hide this. So essentially, we're doing the same thing, running select statement. We're using the open row set command, but we're just specifying that the format is Parquet. So that's the only thing that you're going to need to do to tell serverless that you're going to connect to a Parquet file. And we can still run the same select statements. Just a quick recap on the file path function. This is the function that enables you to expose data lake partitioning, and that's what you can use to expose the values of the partitions in the data lake, but also use that to filter. Yeah, so you can create a view, for example, use the file path function, and that'll be exposed. I'm not sure whether it will come up in the exam, but you can either create external tables or you can create views in serverless. With native serverless external tables, you don't have any support for partitioning. So that's all to do with lake databases. You're not going to get any of that in the exam. So file path, that's the function that you use to partition and filter. So we've got Parquet. We also have the Delta format as well. Again, it's just format equals Delta. We don't need to use any of the file path functions with Delta because the Delta format itself holds all of the partitioning information in its metadata. You'll just see those as columns in your select statement. So file path you can use with CSV and Parquet and JSON. Delta, you don't need to use any of those file path functions. And with JSON, now I said before that with, they call it complex data types, both JSON and Parquet, so you can store nested data within the columns of a Parquet file, we're still using either the JSON value statement or the JSON query statement. JSON value is used when you just want to get a scalar value out of the JSON, out of the nested data. JSON query is where you've got an array of elements that you want to select. So, for example, if I run this select statement, let me just get that up there. Then, as you can see, I'm using JSON value and I'm zeroing in on the attribute that I want to get the value from. Yeah, so I've got an order ID, an order date, a delivery address, .city, order details, position, ordinal position, and the product ID. Yeah, so JSON value for single values. And then if I come down here and use JSON query on the order details, so within that JSON document, order details actually has lots more attributes under it. If I use JSON query and just select, let me just scroll down, then you can see I can get all of the nested objects under there. Yep, so JSON query, scalar, so JSON value, scalar values, JSON query, an array of values. So we'll jump back in. So that just finishes off what we were doing with serverless SQL pools. I didn't want to concentrate too much on that, but important to cover it off because I got 2 questions in the exam around nested data types. So what we'll cover is we're going to look at source controlling within a Synapse workspace. We're going to look at some Synapse Studio visuals and some notebook visuals as well, because there's 2 ways of creating visualizations in the Synapse workspace itself. That's nothing to do with Power BI. We've got that predict function as well, and this came up. I had 2 questions on this as well. So 4 questions on nested data types and using the predict keyword. So we've got some stuff to go through on the predict. On the predict side of things. And then the last section, we're going to look at purview and the 2 areas that you need to know for that. So with source control in Synapse, it's pretty simple. It's only Git. Yep. So TFS, nothing like that. You've just got Git, and we can choose between 2 platforms. We've either got DevOps or we've got GitHub. Yeah, so in your Synapse, we'll see it later on, in your Synapse workspace, you can either connect to Azure DevOps or you can connect to GitHub. That's it. That's your options. In terms of Synapse Studio visuals, yes, within the Synapse workspace itself, we can create some visuals. They're pretty simplistic, to be quite honest with you. There's only 6 chart types: area, bar, column, line, pie, and scatter. You can't even really plot multiple categories on the same chart. It is the most basic. And essentially, through the SQL queries in Synapse Studio, we've either got table or we've got charts. If you click into chart, that'll give you the charting options that you can go through. Like I said, really, really simple. There's only a few options in there. But Spark notebooks. Now, yes, I remember getting a question on this. All right. So there is a tutorial in the Learn modules for Microsoft about Spark notebooks. And yeah, I mean, it might trip people up. Maybe I was lucky I only got one, or maybe I was, unlucky that I got one anyway. However, importing matplotlib libraries, creating a data frame with data, using pandas with the data frame, and then creating the charts from pandas. Now, the question was really around the charting, if I remember rightly. However, you can import matplotlib, Seaborn, and pandas, create a data frame from some data, and then convert that to pandas. And then you've got your charting options here. I do remember that if you look at that very sort of top, oops, where's my mouse? This here. So AX1 equals charting data salary dot plot. This I remember having some questions on, or having a question on around the different plot options, but there's like one single tutorial. Whether you want to worry about it too much or not, it was one question, and I don't want everybody going off and thinking that they're going to have to learn a whole bunch of Spark visualizations. However, from a top level process, you import the libraries, you create the data frame, you convert that to pandas, and then you chart it. So if there's, I don't know, any questions about what you do in a sequence, this is what we're going to do in terms of visualizations. Now, predict. So it's a T-SQL function in dedicated SQL pools where we can score data. So we actually have a model saved that we can use in T-SQL. So we've got the 4 main points are that it only supports the Onyx modeling runtime. Okay, so at the moment, predict, it only has support for Onyx. So if there's anything that comes up in the exam about different runtimes, at the moment, it's just Onyx. But you need to declare the model and load it into a variable. Okay, now that variable is a var binary max. That's the question that I got, was the data types. What was the required data type when loading a model for the predict function. var binary max, that's what loads the model. You know, that's what is used to load the model into the session that you're looking to score. In terms of the data itself for scoring, you can get that data from a common table expression, a table, a view, or a table valued function. So on the right hand side, and again, I think my mouse keeps on jumping around a bit. Okay, after we've declared our model, right, as you can see here, I've just got a CTE to create the data set. Yeah, so I'm selecting a customer, their age, and then several attributes that I'm then feeding into the model, and then I'm going to get a prediction out of that. Yeah, so really the question was just about either the available runtimes for predict and the data types used to store the model. Okay, all right then. So what we'll do is very quickly, we'll go into Synapse Studio. I've got a fresh Synapse here that I've opened. Just check the time. Okay. Now in Synapse Workspace, on the Manage area, down at the bottom, we've got Git configuration. Okay, so just one source control option at the moment, which is Git. But if I configure, then on the repository type, I can select either Azure DevOps, Git, or GitHub. Okay, so if you've got a TFS repository, it's not going to work. And the likelihood in the exam, it's going to, you know, there might be a question about which source control providers are supported. But we go into DevOps Git. All right, just going to sign in. I won't bother hooking it up because we don't really need to go through the whole thing. However, I can select my DevOps repository, find a project, and then I can create a new branch. I can create a new repository from Synapse Studio itself, select my collaboration, publish branch, and then hook it up to source control. I don't remember anything deep dive in terms of all of these options within this the exam itself, but suffice to say, Git, DevOps, Azure DevOps, and GitHub. Okay, so let's go back to our slides. And for the last bit, we'll talk about Purview. So with Microsoft Purview, so not Azure Purview anymore, Microsoft Purview, we're looking at two main areas. We're looking at integrating and scanning Power BI with Microsoft Purview, then using or understanding the two parts of the service that are relevant to the DP-500, which is the data map and the data catalog. So they're the two main areas that we're looking at here. So we've got data catalog and data map. Now, before we look at those two things, we'll just look at what it looks like from a Power BI perspective when that's integrated with Purview, because essentially Purview will connect to a Power BI tenant and it's going to scan that tenant and pull in a list of what they call assets. And the assets will be dashboards, reports, data sets, and data flows, right? And from a lineage perspective in Purview, you'll be able to see the flow or the lineage of that information from the source data. So, you know, in this example, it's an Azure SQL database to a data flow. Yeah, then you've got several data sets that are connecting to that data flow. Then you've got several reports connected to those data sets, and finally dashboards connected to the reports. So you'll see a flow. Now the red writing is just me augmenting the screenshot with what those objects are. So dashboards, reports, data sets and data flows are tagged as assets within Purview. So in terms of the two, excuse me, in terms of the two areas, we have got let me just skip forward. Sorry, we've got the data map in Purview. Now the data map is where you go to register the data sources. So like a Power BI tenant, like Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pools or serverless SQL pools. The data map is where you catalog your assets. Oh, sorry, catalog is the wrong word because it's got data catalog there. It's where you map your data assets. And it also includes the concept of collections. So a collections are really an organizational topology. Yeah, they can be organized however a company would like to organize their assets. It could be by regions, it could be by business units, but it's a collection of data assets. And from those collections, we can connect to and initiate scans on the data sources. Yeah, so the data map, it's not really for end user consumption. It's for people to go and set up scanning the data sources themselves, the databases, the data lakes, Power BI tenants. The data catalog, on the other hand, that's the area to browse those assets. So you can browse the assets either by the collection. Yeah, so collections can be assigned permissions. So maybe a certain sales region can only see a certain collection. Don't remember anything as granular as that in the certification, but you know, just for some learning perspective. But you can also search for assets, type in assets, find everything that you want to do with customers, and also the business glossary. So that's defined in the catalog as well. So the business glossary is something in which you create. It can be a hierarchical collection of terminology, and you link those business glossary terms to assets that you've added. I stopped saying the word catalog. Assets that you've mapped in your data map, right? And then from a visualization perspective, that's all under data catalog. Yeah, so data catalog is the business glossary and searching for your data assets. So let's have a quick look at that. So I'll jump into Purview. So from the data map perspective, if I click on data map, let me just zoom down a little bit. So I'm just going to extract that. So what I've done is I've just created a global collection and a regions collection. Yeah, because maybe I only have one Power BI tenant in my organization, so perhaps that tenant is just used globally. But under my regions, I've got Sales South and Sales North, and I might want to register specific databases or data warehouses under those collections. But from here, this is where I set up my connections to my data sources and scan those data sources. So for example, data map, sources, register. And as you can see, I can catalog Synapse Analytics, so dedicated SQL pools and serverless SQL pools, databases. I can catalog data lakes, Databricks, etc. I really only ever saw Power BI from the certification perspective, okay? But there may be something on Synapse Analytics as well. Dedicated SQL pools and serverless SQL pools are the objects from a Synapse workspace you can catalog. You probably won't see anything about pipelines or the lineage available within pipelines within the DP-500. It's completely out of scope. That's more on the data engineering side. So the data map, this will be used for creating a connection to your data sources and then organizing those within collections. Whereas the catalog, this is where people can come and search. So for example, the first thing I can do is go in and manage, a business glossary and say, okay, well, I'm going to create a new glossary. I'll call it sales. I'm the expert in sales, apparently. Create that glossary. And then what I can do is I can start to create some terms. So I can say, let's say my favorite, EBITDA. Yep. And then I just attach my definition. And then what I can do is in related, okay, I can connect to synonyms or related terms, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, add links and things like that. So in the business glossary, that's where I can kind of define my sort of hierarchy of terms. Going back to the catalog, then we can browse assets. So if we go into browsing assets, then as you can see, I can browse by collection. Yep. So if I've only got access to look at the resources in Sales South, I'll only be able to see and browse that collection, or by source type. And then everything that's been scanned is just kind of, cataloged into a source type. So for example, Power BI, that was the tenant that I scanned. So if I click into Power BI, I'll see all the workspaces there. If I go into by collection and go into global, then I'll be able to start seeing all of my Power BI assets themselves. And then I can start to narrow the results. So I can say, well, I only want to see dashboards. Yeah, now the terminology for this is in Purview, data pipelines are data pipelines from Data Factory, from Synapse Analytics. They also show Power BI data flows. Yeah, so there's nothing in Purview to say specifically data flow. It'll come under data pipeline. You're not going to need to know any of this for the DP-500. I think it's just an interesting aside that that's how they catalog it within Purview. But like I said, you can browse, you can filter on reports, and then go into a report, for example, see all the information about that, the workspace it's in, etc., and then look at the lineage. So you can see that, this report comes from this data set. That data set is connected to that data flow, which in turn is connected to the SQL database. Yeah. So really the only questions that I had in DP-500 were around the catalog and around the map and understanding, what each of those services does. Okay, so we've pretty much covered all of the content. Is there any questions about any of this so far? If I bring up the last of the slides, then learning resources, serverlesssql.com, Data Mozart. Nikola has got much more coverage of the DP-500 and including the online course that Nikola does as well. But all of the Synapse and Purview-y stuff you'll find on my blog, serverlesssql.com, that's under the category DP-500, and you'll see all of the Purview, because I appreciate that not a lot of that people might not have access to Purview. Yeah, and it's quite irritating because the only way to get hands-on with Purview is to create an instance of Purview, but the problem is Purview is going to cost you as soon as you start doing it. From a serverless SQL and Synapse perspective, you can actually create a Synapse workspace, use serverless SQL pools, and if you only using a very tiny data set, it's going to cost you pennies. Link it into source control. You can do all that for free. It's only the dedicated SQL pools that you'd have to worry about in terms of pricing. You wouldn't really have to provision dedicated SQL pool to get familiar with Synapse Studio and integrate it with Power BI. You can probably do all that for free, really. Well, Dan, there will, yes, they record, yes, both the sessions are being recorded. So the session that we had on Tuesday and the session that we've got today, yep, is being recorded. So it would be, the Data Weekender crew basically putting the resources up on YouTube at some point. So we could probably finish off going back to the DP-500 page. Yeah, so we've gone full circle on this, and I think it's worth reiterating a few points that we spoke about in the first session, which was, in my opinion, there's two very good valid ways of approaching this certification. Number one is you already are knowledgeable in these areas and you're just coming to validate that knowledge, to identify some gaps and fill those in. We all got gaps in our knowledge that we need to skill up on in certain aspects. So it's coming to validate your existing knowledge. The second one is learning it from scratch. Okay, and it's really important, and I think this is a really important point that I want to cover, is that if you don't know much about Synapse and you don't know much about Power BI, does that mean that you should be excluded from taking this exam? No, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Yeah, don't want people gatekeeping this sort of thing. Think of the skills being measured. Yep. So download the study guide. Yep. If you're serious about taking the certification, or you don't really want to do an exam. Yeah, exams sometimes are not for a lot of people. I hate sitting exams. Honestly, I've done loads of them and I still sit there and I still get nervous and I still start to forget things. This is Microsoft's way of bordering what this role is. It gives you a defined focus on the areas and the tasks and the responsibilities for doing this sort of work. So, for example, if you're not that bothered on the visualization side of Power BI, I mean, there are so many people out there that are so clever at visualizing data, at telling a story. I'm not one of those people, right? But I don't want to be excluded from using Power BI. Using something like this, it puts boundaries around learning. Yeah, so you can go through this. You can then learn what you need to know about Synapse. Synapse has got tons of different services in it. Yeah, with this, you can just concentrate on those two services. Completely valid. Or, in the end, if you only ever use one of those services, serverless SQL pools, for example, completely valid as well for use in this scenario. But that exam page, yeah, that'll be your jumping off point. It's got the study guide. So everything in here, in terms of the line by line items that you'll be tested on, these are all things that you can go and find. So, for example, Nikola's course is going to cover these from, a real world perspective in the course. So you'll be learning how to do this as well as learning how to pass, the certification as well. But also from, got a couple of minutes left, from an exam perspective, there is a sandbox as well. So if anyone didn't see that from the first time around on Tuesday, again, if you want to get yourself up to speed with how a Microsoft certification is done, maybe you haven't done many, maybe you haven't done one before, and you just need to get a flavor for how an exam, is, how Microsoft present an exam. We've got a sandbox. Yeah, there is a finite amount of ways that Microsoft present questions. And sometimes, and I think I said this on Tuesday, is that sometimes you might not know the answer until you read the question and can, by process of elimination, knock out the wrong answers. Usually, and it's not, it's just my experience over the years, is that if you've got multiple choice where you can just select one answer, usually half of those answers are clearly wrong. And then it's just a case of whittling them down and then maybe making an educated guess. Yeah, it's not about knowing the answer to every single question that appears. You can trim it down and by process of elimination get to an answer as well. But yeah, the sandbox, great way of getting used to how an exam is being presented to you. Yeah, so you can go through it several times and just get used to how you're going to do it. So I think we're actually bang on time.
Yeah, I was just going to add on that, just quickly on the topic of kind of working out the, or having a sense of how the exams work. One of the other exam cram sessions we did was how to think like a certification exam. So I am desperately trying to find out who it was who did it. It was Will somebody. But yeah, one of the other ones on the YouTube channel is, it was William Assaf. There we go. So he's done a talk for us. You'll find that along with the DP-500 ones, and it just talks about how to approach a Microsoft certification exam. So that's really useful as well. So yeah, with regards to these two recordings, I missed session 1, so I want to go back and have a look. Session 1 is already on our YouTube channel, which I'll put in the chat.
Ooh.
And
the one from Tuesday.
Yeah, it's already up.
Look at that. That is the quality of service.
There you go. Yeah, that is rapid, right? So I don't know when 2 will be up, but yeah, we already got 1 up. So if you want to check out there, and some of the other exam cram sessions are also available. So both, thank you very much. It's been a great 2 days. I appreciate you taking the time to do these 2 sessions. It's been really good.
Anytime.
Yeah.
Anytime as well. Yeah. Thanks for hosting us.
Yeah. So yeah, appreciate everyone who's turned up. There's yeah, I hope you had a good time. I think we're kind of just a little bit, so I don't know if you're all familiar with Day Weekender, but normally we are a quite popular online conference that just runs to be on a weekend normally. We're kind of on the verge of, well, we're just about to announce the next date for that. So if you have been to one of our events before, or if you haven't, look out for us, and I'm sure you'll have a great time, because we do get a good feedback on the event. So once again, thank you, Nikola and Andy, and I wish you all a good evening.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Day, evening, night,
Thanks,
whatever.
Lloyd. Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.